advice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't go.
Howdy, Rob.
Howdy, Matt. I want to announce to the listeners that we're doing a rebrand. We're paying attention to trends, to changes in the market, and DM of None is now Meta of None. It is right. we are changing to reflect the fact that this is the future is a metaverse. And we are a part of that.
We know a lot of people think that it's like a good idea or fun to listen to our show on headphones, like at work or while, I don't know, folding laundry. That's out. That's out. We're only video live streaming with AI generated avatars.
That's right.
You have to be live in the room.
From now on, you'll be using a token to log in to our proprietary Web3 DM of Noneverse, and sitting your fake virtual butt in a chair and listening to watching our floating heads talk.
Yeah, we're getting meta. We're talking about metagaming.
Yes,
today,
and it's interesting. We have absolutely talked about metagaming, and it comes up a lot. We have not done a full episode on metagaming, and it's. Here's the thing. I'll tell you why. I think it's because we both think it's an annoying thing to talk about and an annoying topic, and so it has not been a priority. But I am actually excited to address this because there is a lot of talk about metagaming, and it is an interesting topic for GMs to cover.
Our initial response is always like, "Oh, this isn't a problem, whatever," and then move on. But obviously, there's more to it than that.
I mean, my like big brain take is like, if you have problems with this, then you have problems with your table and with your players, and like it's better solved with talking to people than figuring out how to get around metagaming. That being said, it is, I think, important, especially for new GMs, to maybe understand what it is and how to sort of approach it, because as you'll see, inexperienced players can sort of like stumble into this accidentally, and inexperienced GMs can sort of overreact if they don't know what they're doing. So it is worth addressing.
Big picture, meta problems require meta solutions, Rob.
That's right.
If you have problems with metagaming, maybe you should talk alongside or outside the game, the definition of meta, and with your players. But yeah, let's start with like some of the new player problems. I just poked around the internet, found some dungeon masters complaining about things, tried to come up with what are people talking about. It's usually stuff like, here's a quote from a random person on the internet: "If anyone here has any tried, tested, and true methods to stop players from metagaming, how do I get players to stop calculating odds?" End quote.
Well, it's a great example of what might be metagaming. I don't. You're probably maybe wondering like what the definition of metagaming is. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Just bear with us.
This is very funny though. It's like, well, I don't know. They're sitting in front of them with a character sheet with numbers and dice.
Right.
Are you asking them
odds,
not to use their brain?
Yeah.
If so, maybe don't play a game with dice and odds.
Depending on who you ask, like, what is metagaming varies, dramatically. Matt found a hilarious article on on Comic Book Review about a player who got kicked from their group for reading the manual.
Yeah, go ahead and read that quote, Rob.
In a post made to the subreddit for the classic tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, the OP explains how they spent their free time reading over the rule books and learning the core mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, because it is nothing like any of the games they played growing up. The other players and the Dungeon Master apparently interpreted the newbies' actions as metagaming and kicked them from the party, which is really funny. Now,
fellas, is it metagaming to learn the rules?
Now, so here's the thing. I've had new players, pick up the module that I was running and like read ahead, or like open up the monster manual and like look up a monster stats. That to me is metagaming in a way that I don't like. But you might say, well, there's not a whole lot of daylight between that and like reading the rules. Like, where do you draw the line? And that's a great question. But, you know, this is what we mean when we say metagaming, and you know, it varies.
I mean, yeah, it absolutely varies. So I suppose you could run a table where no one knew the rules but you, and everyone everyone else was just kind of improving and saying what their characters did without any knowledge of their own stats or abilities. And yeah, you just ran the game. You could do that. I don't think very many people do. Another complaint was, how do I stop players from saying things that don't make sense in the game world? Like, I only have 15 HP, heal me, or give me a +2 or advantage on a check. Is this a problem, Rob? To have player?
I mean, not to me. I guess if it really, like, if you're really immersed in the verisimilitude of your Dungeons & Dragons game and people are saying this might upset you. You know, a more common example is, like, a player saying, well, like, how much HP does the monster have? Like, does it look like it has half HP? And this is funny because in 4th edition you had bloodied, and so you could sort of measure, like, if a monster was more than half hurt but doesn't exist anymore. It's a totally valid thing to ask, like, how injured does the monster look? But I can't, I you know, what they want is like an HP number, and I can't really give that because that's kind of like game, like, you know, immersion breaking. But that's, again, it kind of depends on how much you care, how much that like disrupts your gameplay.
Is it metagaming to have your players work together, or to have one of them try not to die?
Yeah,
sure.
I mean,
you could say,
maybe
you should help me out with this task instead of grant advantage. But you gotta decide how nitpicky do you want to get with your players. If you have a game where there's a +2 to checks, people are going to default to that terminology.
I mean, metagaming is also, you know, often referred to like game knowledge that you might not have. And again, this is also very subjective. I have an example from my Cyberpunk game that came up recently. Yeah. One of my players received a private message from a potential, you know, somebody who might not have the group's best interest at heart. And, you know, I was reading it out to them. And then one of the other players, a newer player, was like, I want to make a human perception check on, you know, this person to see what they got. And I'm like, you have no way of knowing that they received a private message. That came to their, you know, to their agent and they read it. You have no reason to suspect them of doing anything. This is, you know, metagaming. And in this case, this was kind of useful because this new player had never actually metagamed before. She had no idea that what she was doing was potentially taking player knowledge that her character wouldn't necessarily know.
Even that, Rob, is like not a bad thing.
No, it wasn't bad at all.
For example, signaled to the player that got the special information that this other person at the table is kind of curious about this plot line too. So if they're looking for someone to bring in, you know, that should be a signal to them, and that can be something that's made explicit. You can say to that player, hey, actually, you should just tell them, like, if you're dealing with some shit in your personal life, I've got experience, like, I can help you take this person out, and then they can make that choice.
It did end up being like a good for the table to like talk it out and like think about these things. And that wasn't bad. It was a learning experience and a roleplay experience for everybody. But that is, you know, that can go in a number of different directions depending on your table and your group. Okay,
well, this brings us to, trying to nail down in a general sense what metagaming is. You know, it could basically be, if you really start thinking about it, if you really, you know, pass the blunt around, you're like, well, maybe everything is metagaming. And maybe you're not wrong, because yes, boundaries between our characters and ourself are fuzzy. There's even, Rob, I was blown away that there is a Wikipedia article titled Metagaming (role-playing games).
Well, and this is interesting, and we'll link this, but friend of the show, LegalKimchi, has a really, really good video essay on metagaming where he talks about it, and he also like links to a great academic article. Mm-hmm. And so I want to sort of break down, because metagaming means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So in like sort of like the big picture sense, meta gaming is gaming about gaming. And like it, the sort of example, and I think where the term, it didn't originate but was popularized, has to do with poker, specifically Texas Hold'em.
Right.
And this is helpful for me when thinking about it, because the metagame in Texas Hold'em has to do with thinking about like what your opponent might do, and even more than that, what they think that you think they might do. Different layers of thinking about, it's
right. It's describing a like game theory style strategic situation.
Yes. The one definition is making a player or decision that has been influenced by external knowledge rather than based on fundamental strategy alone, right? So you can play poker and you can just try to do the best. You can just try to make wise decisions about what cards to keep and what to go for, but you will not win if you do that, because any idiot can choose, well, not any idiot, but that part's easy. What's really challenging is like knowing what your player is thinking and trying to get them to make mistakes, or knowing what your opponent is thinking, etc.
In a similar line, right, in other competitive games like StarCraft or
yep.
Magic the Gathering, you could be like, all right, I'm going to play the best game possible, but if you know your opponent is likely to pick Zerg or an aggro mono red deck, that deck that is objectively good is probably not the best deck to deal with those decks. So you're going to change what your build is or whatever, right? This is the meta people talk about with like
right.
Dota or whatever.
I mean, this is a great example. I was never competitive at StarCraft, but I'd like to play competitive games. And I did not want to spend all of my time thinking about the meta. I got good at one thing, and I got as far as that would take me, and then I stopped playing. Because I did not really feel like learning 10,000 different things and trying to like get in my opponent's head and modifying the strategy. But like a lot of people, if you want to be competitive, you in competitive games, metagaming is necessary. Like it's a mental game, and you have to sort of like understand the strategy, right? You have to, if you want to compete at the highest level, and this is true of everything from poker to chess to StarCraft, you have to use the most, competitive strategies, and you have to be aware of, what your opponent is likely to use, and so on and so forth. And this does not apply to role-playing games, but I think it's a good starting point, because I think the root of a lot of metagaming, or what we think of metagaming in tabletop, has to do with people trying to win, or thinking that they need to compete, or thinking that they need to be optimal. And so they do things that are not, in this comparison, they're not picking a strategy for their Terran StarCraft game. They're doing what they think they need to do to win. And I think this is a sort of like a fundamental misunderstanding of like what TTRPGs are for, but you can understand where the impulse comes from.
Right. And the authors of this academic article describe metagaming in role-playing games as breaking the fourth wall, and it has a very different usage. But I think one thing that is similar, right, is if your mindset is in the right place. Role-playing games are a shared story or art or a fun thing to do with your friends. If your mindset is any of those things, then metagaming is not only like positive, but probably necessary at all times. Just like to compete in StarCraft, it's necessary to metagame. Same is true for role-playing games, if your mindset is in the right place.
Correct. It's interesting because as we have alluded to, theoretically, you might want to, or you might think of your role-playing experience as, you're perfectly insulated. Your character is perfectly insulated from you, the player. Any knowledge that you, the player, have, the character might not have, and the character will act, if you are role-playing or gaming well, like precisely in line with their desires and motives. And so if you are a big dumb orc barbarian, you will always charge directly at the closest enemy and hit them with your axe, because that is what Grognak the barbarian would do. But that is not how people play, and that is not always fun for everyone. In fact, it's often not. when you sort of rigidly adhere to, what would my character do? And so there's a lot of good metagaming that involves, figuring out how you are going to work together with your party and using some out of game knowledge to make informed decisions. I mean, one thing I think about often with regards to metagaming is if your characters encounter a vampire, it's got a cloak, widow's peak. He's saying, "I want to suck your blood," and he's, and it's like turning into bats. Like, are you going to expect them not to, like, try to use a daylight spell or garlic or steaks or anything? Like, are they not going to look for, like, are you expecting them to be like, what is this strange creature that's attacking us and wants to drink our blood? Like, that's silly, right? Like, somebody is going to, like,
right.
say we try to, like, knock a hole in the ceiling so that he gets hit by daylight or by, like, the sun. Like, that's, but if they do the same thing with, like, with a troll, for example, and they're like, well, I use fire or acid on it, that's, that's possibly something that their characters might know. But, like, this is I think a good example of, like, why it's so difficult to draw the line on metagaming. Like, how much do your players know do your characters know what an elephant is? Like, are they gonna freak out if they see, like, an
right.
elephant? They might not, but, like, that would be like a weird thing to, like, expect them to roleplay. Like, my orc has never seen an elephant before, and so tries to attack it. It's just, it is very challenging to draw this line, I think.
I think you've hit on a great point, and you've given us a first example of one of the more serious things that come up into play, right? Is not exactly characters, let's say, reading through the monster manual at the table, right? But
right.
Just generally knowing what monsters are and what some of the most common things are. Like, knowing that hill giants are, like, kind of not that intelligent or charismatic, and maybe a dominate or charm monster spell would work on them, as opposed to gust of wind trying to knock them over. The most common example, a troll is weak to, stops regenerating when it takes fire damage. Players and characters are as we already alluded to, like, intertwined, right?
Yes.
And you, as the game master, should not be in the business of punishing people who have been playing this game. Like, trolls have had the same problem like weakness to, like, fire and acid or whatever for, like, 30 years, right? If you're asking someone to, like, lobotomize themselves,
right, exactly,
to, like, lose for what does it gain you at the table to make your players make this encounter last 10 more rounds as you make them, I don't know, what are you going to make them do? Randomly try every element on on the troll. So what are you going to do? I mean, I think the easiest is assume that if a player knows some basic facts about the world, that's a good thing, because it's really hard to get your players to know things about your fantasy world and campaign. And anytime they know something, that's actually kind of a positive thing, and they can encourage them to share that information in character. Actually, dragons are powerful spellcasters. Oh, I didn't know that. People who are new to Dungeons and Dragons. Cool. I mean, they learned something, and it scared them too. Cool.
And I think a great way to approach this is, rather than saying, well, you don't know that, come up with a way that they would know that. Have them role play it, or have them explain, like, why their character might know this, again, pretty common piece of lore. Hill giants are stupid. Trolls are weak to fire. Dragons are spellcasters. Again, if they know something, like, incredibly, if, like, they know something about a monster that's, like, incredibly obscure, and then maybe push back. But if they, the player, know, again, one of the many common weaknesses or many common details about a monster that's been in the monster manual for 40 years, just find a way that their player, or their character, might know that. I mean, this is good fun metagaming. It makes the game, interesting. I think it moves things forward. Unless you are really counting on something to, like, make an encounter work, I wouldn't fight them on this.
Well, yeah. What are you again, all metagaming problems have metagaming solutions.
Right.
If you are upset that a player knows something specific about an enemy that you feel like they wouldn't know, you have to ask yourself, what fun, what drama, what tension were you seeking from this, hidden knowledge that you had no reasonable expectation of actually being hidden? And if you ask yourself that question, there's probably, the answer is probably, well, I wanted this fight to be more difficult. Well, then the solution is just, upping the character's hit points or giving them a few more lieutenants in the fight. And if you make it a big deal at your table to make your players handicap for, again, being good at Dungeons and Dragons, right? Having experience playing the game that you want them to play, or whatever other system, then that's not the way to go. Is punishing players for being good at this.
And if from a tactical encounter perspective, you're really attached to this, then put in a troll variant. Make it a fire troll, and they have to use cold on it instead of fire to stop its regeneration. Like throw a curveball. But if you're just using standard monsters and they figured out, that's okay. It's not the end of the world.
Well, here's an example building on that that we read in John Harper's Blades in the Dark DM section. I think we read this full quote on that episode, but I'm going to read it again. Quote, "Keep the meta channel open. When you portray an NPC, tell the players things that are going unsaid. Invite them to ask their gather information questions to dig deeper. The characters have a broad spectrum of senses and intuitions to bring to bear in fiction. The players only have the narrow channel of your few words. Help them out by sharing what they might suspect, intuit, feel, and predict."
I like this a lot, and this is a principle that I follow because, your players only have what you're telling them, and there are things that they are likely, or their characters are likely to pick up on that they may not know to ask about, and you can just go ahead and tell them that stuff. You can give them information that in the game they would probably be able to intuit, or that they would notice. And that's I also think of, the other thing I think about from Blades in the Dark is that really relates to this whole conversation is don't be a weasel. I love that rule from Blades in the Dark. And that means it's if you're doing something annoying to gain an advantage, you're being a weasel. Don't do that. Just okay. Yes, technically, you can do whatever, within the rules, or you might know something, but are you being a weasel about it? Don't do that to gain an extra +2 or whatever. It's a good principle from both directions.
Two examples of how this could work in practice. A quick one for the stupid troll encounter, right? If you put in a different troll, your ranger's going to notice something's up. This troll's skin is burning and looks like lava. You've got to tell them that. If you put in a troll that has a different weakness, but don't describe it any other way, then again, your players only have your few words. In a social encounter, right, this might be okay, you might talk with an NPC with a very monotone, robotic voice, but unless you tell your players their eyes are glazed over, something seems off, they're not acting naturally, right? They might not intuit, right, that this character has been charmed or is under a magical hex or something like that.
Yes.
You've got to keep that meta channel open because your work, you can't rely on your incredible acting skills, especially when you're only saying 10 words.
And this is important because even if you are doing your best in acting and providing a lot of description, your players may not pick up on that. And again, in sort of the fiction, their characters absolutely would. And so you need to sort of help them metagame, or you need to metagame positively in their direction. There are definitely, we've been talking a lot about when metagaming is helpful, but there are definitely times when this is a nuisance. And an example that came up a couple times that kind of blew my mind because I had never encountered this, but it doesn't surprise me, is like a player, inventing gunpowder, like, discovering
Right.
how to like make saltpeter and building a bomb. Like you could do that. Sure. That all the elements exist in Dungeons and Dragons. And I guess if a player knows the process to create saltpeter and gunpowder, but like, why would you do that? Why would you be such a pain in the ass? But somebody might, and that would be metagaming, right? If you take your player knowledge that you know how to like create a bomb out of your own piss on the side of a mountain to fight off, rest in peace, Cormac McCarthy. But like, that would be metagaming in a way that's like really irritating.
Right. Now, again, the solution to this problem, right? This example of, okay, I'm going to build a car or whatever. Like, sure, okay, whatever. I'm going to build a flying machine.
I create a steam locomotive as the Romans did, and it's annoying. Don't do that.
It is you got to ask your players, what are they trying to accomplish? And I think the gunpowder example, as stupid as it is a common one because players often want to blow something up, right?
Yeah, right.
They're often like, well, I think the solution is to explode this dam or, like explode something. And I think that's fine because in a lot of our fiction and movies and stuff, like, there is a ticking bomb or a bomb that the players, and that's exciting. And yeah, usually the players, it's like, okay, I'm going to pile some barrels of lantern oil or whatever, like,
Yeah, right.
And for me, that's fine. Let them do that because bombs or like a big explosion are cool and such a common trope of fiction that you cannot take them out of a game that is even like a medieval fantasy game. It's Greek fire,
Greek
whatever.
Fire.
We don't know.
Give
what
them an
that is.
option.
Yeah. Let them build a bomb, but if they're trying to make a bomb, you just have to ask them, what are they trying to do?
Right. If they want to make a big explosion, yeah, give them a way to make a big explosion. Yeah.
Okay, or give them a way to collapse a building, or sink a ship, or get a dragon to eat a thing that then they can explode, right?
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, in all of these cases, they all sound a hell of a lot more interesting than fighting a creature until its HP goes to 0.
Right.
So if you only like that type of game, well, we're just very different game masters, I suppose. I sort of like it when players are like, well, the plan isn't to kill the dragon, it's to get them to eat the magic crystals that will explode when contacted with fire. That sounds like a hell of a more interesting encounter to me.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of another. This is again sort of metagaming. The peasant railgun. Matt, do you remember this?
Yeah, sure.
So because handing off an item is a free action, right? If you create a line of peasants, sufficiently long, and in 6 seconds they can pass a stone, 100 meters and get it up to like insane velocity. Obviously, this does not work. Again, technically, it's certain interpretations of the rules it would allow this to work, but that would be an incredibly, again, gamey and annoying thing to do, which your players might attempt. But then, like Matt said, a good thing to do is to be like, what are you trying to accomplish here? Like, do you just want to create a railgun because it's fun, or is there an intent to this really annoying metagamey action that you are trying to pull off?
For this situation, I'm going to quote a friend of the show, LegalKimchi, in his episode on metagaming. You have to decide, quote, what your group needs to. Let me take that again. You have to quote LegalKimchi, quote, what your group needs to agree on is what level of metagaming is okay for your table. And I could see 2 possible solutions for this. Your group might be, if we can make something work in the rules, then it's like an awesome power. Maybe not the peasant railgun, but some, combination of special abilities that when taken together in no way could realistically happen, but create a plus 20 bonus. And so we decide that that's actually just a cool special ability that players have, and it's cool when they pull it off. Or we're taking the approach of, this is unreasonable. My ruling is that this can't happen that way. And either is fine. You have to decide, this is just a quick conversation with your players.
Yeah. Let's talk about another pretty common example of metagaming, which is when the group splits. And when this is a great example.
Sorry. Yeah, this is why we hate splitting the party. It's because of metagaming. No.
It's one of the many reasons why splitting the party is annoying and don't do it.
No.
But
it's great.
Yeah, so let's say you're all sitting at the same table, but 2 players go one way and 2 players go the other. And 2 of the players suddenly get into trouble when they're in a different part of the dungeon or the castle or whatever. Your other players don't know that. They have no way of knowing that there's a situation happening with the rest of their party. But I think it's quite common for them to start acting as if they know that something is going on. Yeah. How do you deal with this? How do you approach this? Again, this is information that their characters would not have, but they are going to try to want to act on it. So how do you metagame this, right?
We've moved from the basic level to, I think, the level that most game masters are at with metagaming, right? To steal Matt Colville's definition, metagaming is acting on information your character wouldn't have, right? And this is, a lot of our things we were talking about, we're trying to tell a story and stuff like that. Well, can you tell a story correctly if players are omniscient about what's happening in other places?
Right.
So one solution to this problem that I like is give your players communicators. In one of my games, it's a magic book that the players can write in that makes little scribble noises whenever anyone writes in it. It could be sending stones, or it could be, little comm beads in a sci-fi game.
I give my 5e players sending stones pretty much in like session 1 because, and I'll tell you why I do this. It's not universal, but it's pretty common for me to give them this magic object because they cannot follow this. Like they are, and I don't mean this as like an insult. I just think it's like very hard for certain types of players. They are just very, very bad at acting in character as if they don't know what's going on with the rest of the party. So rather than try to like constantly like slap their hands and be like, you don't know that, I just give them sending stones so they can communicate, or I give them the message spell, or somebody has telepathy or something, just because it's so much easier to do this, to give them a cheap magic item and say, yeah, you can talk to your party wherever they are, than constantly having to like remind them and scold them for using information that they technically don't have.
Yeah. And you've turned a problem into an advantage. You had a meta conversation with your table. I've done something similar where you say, I don't mind if y'all split up and do different things. That's kind of exciting. We can, we'll when that happens, we'll switch between scenes so that everyone's still kind of got some screen time. But yeah, they can still communicate with each other. And here's the thing: if 2 players are off in one direction and the others are somewhere else, and they run into trouble, it's still going to be some time before those people arrive. So the consequences of things are still there. And yeah, it allows us to we had a meta conversation and we developed a in-game tool to deal with it, but that's good meta table talk to deal with it. Now, let's say you're in a game where it's a low magic game. There's no such thing as sending stones or something like that. How do you deal with this then? But I guess our general point still stands, which is this is not a problem.
Yeah.
Just give your players an in-game tool to deal with this, because they're telling you through their meta actions that they would like to know what's happening with everyone, right? They want the little alien heart monitors on every trooper
right.
going down the hall so they can go die too.
Yeah, if it is like a low magic game, or if it's the type of game where this does not make sense, then I think you do have to have this conversation, and then like maybe it happens once, and then every time they want to split up, you remind them, by all means split up, but remember that you don't know what's going on with the rest of your team, and you can't use that information in character. And my feeling is if that's really a problem for them, they just won't split up anymore. Or they'll like that, and they'll like use it as an opportunity to role play in interesting ways. But what you want to work toward is it like not being a problem at the table. So
Right.
that means either being explicit with them about like what it means to separate their characters, or giving them the tools to ignore or work around that. And both are fine. But it's like Matt said, meta problems require meta solutions. You just kind of got to talk about it and explain how that's going to work.
Right. I think your explanation of, oh, it's going to be a problem one time, and then they're going to learn their lesson and either split the party up less, or develop some way to stay in communication, or something like that. Because it comes down to, do you want the players to split up the party? If you do, you need to give them some ability to do so, because
Right.
Again, this is not a huge problem for me. Like, even at that table, like, let's say if the players could give me an interesting reason why they might want to go check in on them, I would let them. And of course, I would say, well, it's going to take you a minute, so we're going to go to you two trying to survive the gibbering mouther you encountered, and
Right.
maybe run away. For the first time at our table, you realize you actually have to run away, which is fun, right? We like
fun.
it when
Yeah.
players have to run away sometimes. Okay, I think this one's similar, Rob, which is, and it's the one you brought up at the very beginning. And this one, I think, is like one that if you haven't encountered at your table, you've probably encountered it from like some very fancy actual play, which is the secret knowledge, right? And
yes.
I think, meta conversation aside, I think it's something we all kind of want, because it creates interesting drama. One player knows something that the other players don't know. Maybe it's because they can read a special language, they get a message from something else, it's something in their backstory, or they discover something that they choose in character or in player to not share with the other party, right?
Yeah. And this, we have said, most of these things are not problems at our table. This one isn't generally, but it definitely this is starting to get closer to things that may actually be, or have been, an issue for me at one point, because I will often give, or players will have, or I will give them secret knowledge, and other players, of course, they will hear that because we are sitting at a table together, and get frustrated or excited or interested.
Normally they just get excited. They're like, oh, this is cool, right?
Yeah, but then they sort of forget to that it's secret.
They're like toddlers. They're like,
They are like
I like this. This is cool, but they can't not take the marshmallow off the
That's
plate.
right. And this isn't like a problem, but it definitely is something that takes some working with, negotiating. And like, usually what happens is that the player with the secret knowledge will share it when it's appropriate, but if they choose not to, then it is very difficult. Again, they are like toddlers. It is very difficult for the other players to sort of forget or act as if their characters don't know that secret knowledge. And I have a few ways of approaching this. One that this is a sort of like a mechanical solution to it, but like, if it's very important that I don't think the rest of my players are going to do a good job of not acting on the information, I will send like a text message or an email or hand a piece of paper to the player with the secret knowledge on it, so that there's no temptation to use that piece of information for the rest of the table. That is one way to get around it.
The meta is still there. The players know that secret knowledge was passed, and that gets them excited.
That gets them
and
excited.
They may still,
If you don't think, again, not to treat them like children, but if you think they're just gonna like get too excited and forget to role play appropriately, then just hand it off secretly, so that it's not like a problem that way. Or you can just try to. I mean, you can do it the hard way. You can just continue to remind them that your characters don't know that. You can't act on this information. You have to wait until whoever shares it with you. Both are fine, but yeah, this is still a meta conversation, right? This is not something that has to like drag your game to a halt or mess with your table. You just have to talk it out. You have to have a meta conversation about the metagaming problem.
Yeah, and I think this is fun because, it creates tension within the party. Like sometimes they're like, oh, is this person working for a different objective than us? I think it's very useful whenever something seems weird or off to immediately move the conversation at the table to the meta conversation. Hey, it sounds like you are trying to figure out what this other person at the table knows.
Yes.
How do you go about that? Remember, they don't have to tell you if they don't want to.
Yep.
Or you can remind the person with the secret knowledge, hey, remember, you know something extra about this.
Right.
Do you choose to share it at this time? I've had people have secret knowledge and then kind of like forget they had it, but everyone else at the table was like, don't you know? And I had to be like, hey, remember this?
Yes.
And they're like, oh, yes. Actually, now is the time I do want to share that.
This has happened to me too, and it's funny. There's a risk of this sort of developing into like a PvP metagame where players are like trying to like bluff other players. Or
I
like
make a deception check against them.
Yeah.
No, you don't.
No, and that you really want to avoid. Like maybe like once or twice, like when like it's really, really critical. But what you don't want is the players trying to deceive or perceive the others at all times, like being actively suspicious. That's just what's annoying and slows the game down. So you
just have to remind them, right? Rolls and these skill checks are for you and me, game master and player, not for each other. You just need to talk to this person right
That's
now.
right. Yeah.
You can go ahead and say out of character, I really want to know this secret. I won't tell it with anyone else. Then describe what your character does.
Right. Exactly. That's a great way to approach it.
And again, for me, this is not a problem. This is actually one of the reasons I play games like Dungeons and Dragons, is to see how these types of things will play out, right? And it does require a meta conversation because maybe not all the players at your table really enjoy this kind of stuff. So you need to see what everyone's level is on this. I don't like it but I've never encountered a player who's like, I don't like secret information and notes, because note passing, time-honored American tradition, we love it. Yeah.
People have fun.
It's kept us from falling asleep in class since second grade.
Yeah, people have fun with this. Let's talk about something that I think is less fun, but I think is a common metagame problem, which is metagaming around optimization, or like optimal decision making, both, right?
Right. And I define this as basically bullying, right? Metagame bullying, where one player is like, actually, you should, rage and double attack, or, actually you should cast this spell instead, right? Because they have perfect game knowledge or whatever, and they try and convince another person at the table to do something other than what they wanted to do.
This can be good and bad. Like if your wizard player is constantly telling your barbarian, you need to rage and power attack and, blah, blah, blah. And that's annoying. But if your wizard player is struggling and is like, God, I don't know what to do, and your barbarian says, well, you've got sleep prepared, and that might be really good against all these goblins, and they're like, oh, thank you, that's great, that's good, right? Like, that is also technically metagaming, right? Your barbarian doesn't, again, in character, doesn't know what sleep does, but like if your barbarian player wants to help your wizard out, like with what their decisions, and they're receptive to that, that's great. Again, that is positive metagaming. And I think it's important to remember, if you're a real hard ass about metagaming, that kind of thing is, I guess, technically not allowed, but it would be so, I think it would be just like such a shitty DM thing to do, to be like, you can't help them make decisions about how to play their wizard because you aren't a wizard and don't know anything about spells. That would be like such like a pain in the ass thing to do. But vice versa, you really don't want to encourage people to, like push their party members into like, you should really take power attack at level 4, if you want to be, optimal, and, you need to make all of these like decisions about your character if you want to like, contribute to the party. That is annoying metagaming, and I would explicitly not allow that.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a lot of the things we've been talking about are whole group conversations.
Yeah.
The bullying optimizer is usually 1 or 2 people at most tables. And that can be like a quick side conversation, right? Which is like, hey, sometimes you gotta just let the other people at the table do what they want to do. It's okay to like give suggestions, right? Or remind the barbarian, don't attack the sleeping enemies. They'll stay asleep until we can go over and slit their throats or something. But don't tell them what to do for every action. I think it's making things less fun. And people will be like, oh, okay, usually it's people who are like get really into the efficiency of a combat heavy type tabletop role-playing game, and that's just a personality type, and people usually realize that they have that trait and are like, okay, yeah, I remember I need to walk that back, thank you.
Usually they're receptive to saying, hey, let people make their own decisions. There's an element of this. I think this is kind of like a gray area where you do have to negotiate with your players and figure out like what your table wants to do, because there's also sort of like a question of optimal decision making, right? So let's say that you have a paladin character who's not terribly bright, but is, just a standard paladin, right? And so they go into a combat with a bunch of goblins or something. It might make sense for the paladin to charge directly at the closest goblin and start smiting. And maybe they'll always do that. But also maybe there's a goblin spellcaster in the back, and actually they decide that they want to charge past the goblin fighters and attack the goblin spellcaster because that's technically the more dangerous foe. Is that in character? Is that too tactical for Sir Gallant Dumbass, the Shining Knight? I don't actually have an answer for this. Like, it wouldn't bother me at my table if
never for me.
If the paladin decided to like do something like tactically a little bit more interesting, but one could make the argument that they really should just charge forward and smite the closest enemy. I don't agree, but
if you are starting to make that argument at your table, then you need to play a different role-playing game, because there's very little in Dungeons and Dragons besides your tactical decisions in combat. And if you're saying someone who is trained in weapons doesn't know who to attack with their weapons, then you need to play a different game.
I agree, but it is something that may arise, I suppose, in meta conversations.
Here's the thing is, I think a pretty standard thing is you need to let players make both optimal and suboptimal decisions based on what that interaction of player and character that is going on within their own soul at this moment. And both are fun. Both lead to fun things. That reckless dwarf who hates ints is charging into the trees because he's like, I want to attack them all. And then, all right, we've got a situation on their hands. This is going to be more interesting than it was before. Or, that paladin who's not very smart is taking out the enemy spellcaster. That's fine. Let them do that.
Right. I mean,
let them play their roles as they choose.
An inverse example is, you're fighting a bunch of bandits, and one of your players has a vendetta against this particular bandit, and so is going after them, super hard when that's maybe not the smartest or best decision. And, but maybe the other players are like, oh no, you can't do that. You gotta, stay behind the barbarian. You're putting yourself at risk. But like, let them play their character. Like, let them make the decisions that they want to make in tactical combat.
We've been talking a lot of specific examples, but this last one brings me to a larger point that I think is a very good one. And we have John Harper, I think, to thank for this one, which is in the conversation about metagaming, in the metagaming conversation that people who are really into the craft of game mastering get into. We're often talking about it's the fact that the players know more than their characters. And actually, the thing we should be more concerned about as game masters is that the characters should know more than the players in like 99.9% of situations, and we need to help that come across in the table. Yes, your dumbass paladin actually knows more about fighting than your character.
Yes.
So this isn't really even the problem here, right? We need to help convey the fact that the characters are in this world and are seeing and experiencing a million more things than is expressed at the table.
Yeah, and we've alluded to this before, but like I think it's a major problem with a lot of DMs, GMs, to only give players like what's written down or what they specifically ask for, which is ridiculous, especially with like game knowledge, like or like universe knowledge. Like if your players seem confused, or you can just like tell them about this king because everybody knows who this king is. Like you don't have to like make a roll or ask me. I'm just going to tell you that King What's-His-Face is the ruler of, this neighboring country. Everybody knows that. Or you would say like, you didn't ask, but like this person smells really bad because he works in a tannery. Like, you didn't think to like ask that question, but that is something that your characters would notice. And I'm really glad that you brought up this Harper quote because I remember that from the Blades in the Dark. And it does require a little bit of extra of effort on the GM's part to try to remember what is obvious to you and that your players might not know to ask about, and what's important, right? You don't have to tell them everything, but there are things that are important, right? There are things that are relevant to the situation that you should just give that information to them because their characters would know.
When you're talking with the biker gang, of course, the person who looks like they're decked out and a hacker in the back is the one who's looking the most nervous. Yes. Yeah, your character notices that right away. Of course. Yeah. How could they not notice? They're a decker themselves.
Exactly. They would pick up on that right away, right? That's not something that they should need to ask about, or that's and this is, again, this will come. I think that there can be an instinct to hide knowledge from your players, and I don't think it's necessarily like a bad one, but I think it's better to give them more, especially when it comes to like details or things that their characters will just know, so they can make better, more interesting decisions, and so that you can keep the fun stuff that they actually do need to work for, like hidden behind a check or having to talk to the right person, that kind of thing. But give them what they need or what their characters would know to make interesting or informed decisions. And then if it is like actual like secret or challenging knowledge, or somebody is trying to hide something, that feels a lot more valuable when they do manage to suss it out.
If you're a game master and you have successfully completed at least one session, I'm going to bet that the bigger problem, right, is that the characters know more about the world than your players, not the other way around. Put that on a sticky note, put it on the back of your screen or on your laptop. Like, just the characters know more than the players in a micro scene, in a single action, in a larger, bigger picture context. This is the problem here, and this is what you can help fix. And speaking of what you can do, I'd like to end with this topic of thinking about the metagaming we do as game masters, right? We have to, right? Our job is to make this a interesting story or a fun time for everyone. So we're constantly thinking about the metagaming. The metagame. How do we do it often? How do we metagame often? And how do we metagame well? I'll start with the first example of consequences. It is great to tell your players, yeah, you can do that. It'll be at disadvantage. It'll be at a -2.
Right.
If you do that, you'll provoke an attack from the goblin that is standing over there. Right.
Right. This is a great example. I want to go back to one of these definitions relating to Texas Hold'em, because I think it's useful.
Oh, yeah.
The highest level of strategy in many complex games, metagame refers to any aspect of strategy that involves thinking about what your opponent is thinking you are thinking. So take this and apply this to
Right.
Dungeons & Dragons. It is actually important to think about what your players think you are thinking, right?
Yes.
And again, this requires like a level of sort of self-awareness and thoughtfulness that is challenging. So I go easy on yourself. But like, if your players are asking you something, again, Matt's example is like, yeah, if you charge past that guy, you're gonna create an attack of opportunity. But like sometimes my players will be like in like going down a path that I really don't want them to go down because they're misunderstanding what is happening in the scene or like what I am setting up for them. And so you have to try to like get ahead of them there. So if they're like, using a cyberpunk example, they're like, well, what does the network infrastructure look like there? And I'm like, well, okay, hang on. This is owned by Arasaka. If you start plugging into this building, they're gonna send a bunch of like spiders down and like blow your network's brains out. Maybe don't do that, right? Like not to just start jacking into random buildings, or your characters know that.
No better than to check into a strange terminal. The most sexual joke in all of Star Wars.
That is such a sexual joke. But like again, it's no big deal if like it's not a huge deal if they just do that. But like you want to sort of like understand what they are getting at and like make sure that they have the character knowledge that is appropriate, right? So they don't do something the characters would know is insanely dangerous and stupid. Like, you can just let them do dumb things, which is sometimes fun. But if their characters would know not to do that, it is important, I think, for you as a GM to get out in front and be like, you can see that guard is, like, watching you. He is going to notice if you try to, like, scale the wall next to him. Rather than just saying, okay, you start climbing the wall and the guard hits you with his halberd.
Blows the whistle. Yeah.
Blows
it's
the
just
whistle.
like, oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, think about what this is going to be like in 2 minutes.
Yes.
Is the player going to be like, I don't care that this is stupid. I want to do it anyway. Or are they going to be like, well, I didn't know someone would immediately notice me, which is important and makes me think that one of the ways to get around this is to ask your players frequently, not just what are you doing? Like, oh, I'm trying to climb the wall. Well, what are you trying to accomplish, right? What is the goal here? And if they say, I'm trying to get in to the data center unseen, well, then you can be like, well, climbing the wall here is a bad idea because people can see you. Now I understand. Ask them what their goal is, not just what they're doing.
This is such an important thing to do because and I do this all the time because my players will do things and maybe I haven't communicated like the scene well or explained like what the challenges are, and they'll ask something. They'll be like, well, why do you want to do that? What are you trying to accomplish? And then I'll have to say, okay, I get it. Probably what you're going to do is not going to accomplish that, but here's some other ways that like you can approach this particular challenge that are not going to end up with you thrown in jail or immediately murked by somebody. And they always appreciate that because again, it's just I haven't communicated very well or they're misunderstanding sort of like what's in front of them. And rather than just
players are working on limited information. They don't know everything that's going on. They only know what you've said. Maybe you haven't said all the things you needed to say.
Exactly. And rather than just like let them do the thing that is, again, within the fiction going to create massive problems for them in the party.
Right.
Again, sometimes that can be fun. And you need to think like, is your player and is their character, like, would they do something stupid because it seemed like a good idea? Then go ahead and let them do it. But if that's not what they're trying to do and they're going to be really frustrated when they get smacked down immediately, work ahead of that. And this is a great example of, GM metagaming.
Yeah. Think about it in the short term, like what you're doing this turn, this action, but also this can be big picture, right? It's okay to ask the party when they're making a plan, what is your goal here? And they say, oh, actually, we want to work for both rival corporations. We're going to try and play them off each other. And then you can be like, okay, thank you. It can be like, well, we plan to explore the mountains west of here next time. Thank you. Okay, now I know what to prep.
Now you know what to do.
It's just,
exactly.
Ask these big meta, what are you trying to do here questions as frequently as you can. Are there any, I can think of a couple other short game master metagaming, right? We use things like consent forms or safety tools. That's a form of metagaming that we need and must have. I occasionally will do very quick cut scenes. I got this from the West End Star Wars role-playing game, which often started with, Imperials on the deck of a Star Destroyer discussing their plans, and then it shifts to the players who are the rebels. That lets the players immediately know, out of character knowledge, that they're absolutely going to use during the game, but it makes it more fun. Like, you can try that. Just don't monologue a 10-minute scene for your players. That's too long.
Right.
2 minutes max.
No, these are great examples. Like, out of player, perspective, giving big picture or world information, that is going to impact their decision making is great. I mean, again, you're telling a type of story, right? Like, you're all, obviously this depends on what you're playing, but yeah, letting them know like what certain groups are up to is technically metagaming, but it can be a great way to sort of to give them useful information and help them better participate in the fiction.
Yeah. I think our overall point is that it's a fool's question to be like, how do I stop metagaming, or like metagaming is bad.
Right.
In fact, metagaming is necessary to play any game, and especially a game as complex as a TTRPG. And it's fine and it's necessary. You got to think about how you want to use the tools of metagaming to make your role-playing game better.
And when most people are talking about metagaming or complaining about it, it's either like a player being a nuisance, in which case you probably just need to talk to them about it and work with it, or it's players unintentionally making things difficult for your GMing, just because they're not, that it's challenging to separate character and player. And that is also just sort of like a conversation and a metagame adaptation. And it does not have to be, I think a lot of the stress around this originates from, feeling like there's an adversarial relationship with your players or your DM. And, the best thing you can do for your game is dismantle that as soon as possible. Because if you are cooperating with your players and they are cooperating with you, most of the time it's, in my experience, pretty easy to manage these things. You will find either a compromise or figure out a way to make sure it doesn't happen again, and it will all be okay. But if you are, if your players feel like they're in competition with you or they're trying to win, then this is going to keep coming up.
Right. Thinking poker style metagame, you have to ask yourself, what's the metagame at my table? If it's, can I get one over on my players by surprising them with a thing that they wouldn't know in character knowledge, then you're playing the wrong metagame as a dungeon master. You got to make sure you center the metagame at your table to whatever kind of game you want to play. Is it to have a fun tactical combat RPG? Sure. Is it to tell a dramatic story of betrayal and fall from grace? Is it to just have fun? Ask yourself, what are the poker metagames that you want to play at your table, and make sure your actions are working towards those.
Absolutely. This is obviously not the final word on metagaming, but I do think that it is manageable and not as big of a problem as you might think it was, based on the sheer volume of ink spilled about the topic. But I hope this was helpful. If you have thoughts or questions or want us to address something else about metagaming, please write us at dmofnone@gmail.com. You can add us on Twitter at dmofnone. You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/dungeonmasterofnone.
Hate the player, not the metagame.
That's right. So whatever you do, keep rolling them dice.